At a certain stage in life, when consciousness begins to transform, whether after an illuminating spiritual revelation or through the slow, almost imperceptible dissolution of one's former personal identity, an individual suddenly feels the familiar ground literally slipping away from beneath their feet. What once seemed unshakable and known turns into something profoundly alien. As if piercing the thinnest veil of illusion, they begin to see through the hidden mechanisms of their own repetitive patterns and become aware of the deafening, ceaseless noise of the world around them. And following this, an all-encompassing silence descends. In the first moments, this silence feels sacred and incredibly empowering, like a life-saving gulp of fresh air after escaping a burning building. However, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the meaning of existence begins to dissolve, not as a result of a sudden catastrophe, but like a quiet, unhurried fading, as if the soul itself dimmed the light of life and then forgot to turn it back on. The drive for anything vanishes, the desire to take any action disappears. This doesn't stem from despair, but from a unique state of sacred exhaustion, an emptying that, while strangely peaceful, simultaneously frightens with its stillness. And it is then, in this ringing void, that a tormenting, barely audible whisper of questions arises. Why do I feel such overwhelming emptiness now that I have finally grasped the truth? This is a surprising paradox that it seems no one ever warns us about. Society and various teachings often instill in us that spiritual awakening must ignite a fire of new purpose, that seeing through the veil of illusion will illuminate us with the brightest clarity and inspire us to great achievements. Yet, for many, especially those who are highly sensitive, for tireless truth-seekers, for empaths, and for those who have dared to embark on the deepest journey inward, awakening acts quite differently. It empties the soul's vessel, purging all false motives and attachments, until even the desire for anything becomes utterly unrecognizable. And it is in this newfound, astonishing emptiness that it's very easy, sometimes mistakenly, to confuse genuine awakening with ordinary apathy. But what lies behind this silence, and how can one distinguish the true path from delusion? The answer to this question can change everything. I recall a detailed conversation with an exceptional friend, brilliant and deeply spiritually attuned, well-versed in the works of thinkers like Eckhart Tolle, Krishnamurti, and Alan Watts. She had recently experienced a profound period of spiritual crisis, often called the dark night of the soul, and emerged from it with remarkably clear and deep insight. At that time, she recounted that she had grasped the true nature of the illusory quality permeating notions of self-identity, the pursuit of achievement, and external conditional love. However, just 2 months later, this same woman was found lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, immersed in a state of unexpected apathy and inaction that she had not foreseen at all. "Before I used to cry because I wasn't doing enough," she confessed then. "Now, I don't care if I do anything at all. I truly believed this awakening would inspire me and fill me with energy. Instead, I feel completely extinguished, devoid of any spark." The renowned psychoanalyst Carl Jung unequivocally pointed to the existence of such a threshold in the human psyche. He characterized it as a sacred territory located between the complete collapse of the former ego and the emergence of the true self. This is a liminal space that instills dread with its all-consuming silence and absence of familiar landmarks. Within it, the driving forces, previously fueled by the external persona and the desire for social approval, gradually lose their power and dissolve, leaving behind only pliable, not yet fully formed matter, like raw clay awaiting its transformation. It is crucial to understand this state is by no means a sign of failure or breakdown, as it might seem at first glance. On the contrary, it is a key stage in the process known as individuation. Jung compared it to the pupa stage in psychic development, where a caterpillar transforms, dissolving into a formless substance before gaining the wings of a butterfly. In essence, it is a kind of psychological death, absolutely necessary for the subsequent rebirth and full flourishing of the new self. This emptiness should not be mistakenly interpreted as regression. For at the very heart of this seeming void lies a much deeper call, a barely perceptible pulse of the soul's authentic truth, waiting to be heard. It is not about a desire to prove anything, but an inner impulse to be, to move. This is not dictated by a need for external validation, but is born from a deep inner resonance. This discussion is not at all about a state of despair. It describes that unique moment that occurs after awakening, when the former sources of life energy dry up and a completely new influx is only just beginning to form. Carl Gustav Jung, the eminent psychologist, deeply understood that the true privilege of human existence lies in revealing one's true essence. The loss of accustomed motivation is by no means the end of the journey. On the contrary, it signifies a sacred beginning of life, a transition from existing as a mask to being in the soul's true form. The distinguished thinker Carl Gustav Jung, the architect of analytical psychology, long before this topic gained widespread recognition in modern spiritual circles, foresaw the advent of this unusual and silent state, akin to a fog that envelops a person after awakening. He did not seek to shroud this phenomenon in mysticism or overly euphoric formulations. On the contrary, he described it with piercing clarity, speaking of the soul delving into its own inner depths, which occurs as soon as the unconscious begins its active operation. Jung himself once insightfully remarked, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And while these words may seem poetic, they contain a truly terrifying truth. Genuine awakening does not promise cloudless bliss. Instead, it strips a person of all coverings, revealing their true essence. This process shakes and shatters the carefully constructed framework of the false self, initiating a slow but inevitable and sacred dying, the dying of the image one used to consider oneself. A deep internal collapse, though hidden from external view, has far-reaching effects on an individual's existence. Former driving forces, the pursuit of ambition, the thirst for achievement, the need for recognition, gradually begin to melt away, losing their former power. The temporal benchmarks one once scrupulously followed, the goals that once served as a guiding star, and even the very structures of their identity that defined relationships, professional activity, and daily routines, begin to dissipate like mirages in the light of a deeper emerging truth. However, a crucial psychological nuance emerges here. The individual's ego does not disappear entirely. It does not undergo ultimate demise. It is merely disoriented. The script of life, by which it once confidently moved, has been completely destroyed, but a new narrative path has not yet manifested. The result of this process is not ordinary laziness or apathy, but a profound spiritual limbo. The person is no longer in the state of their former unconscious sleep, but they have not yet fully awakened to what awaits them. This enigmatic phase is known in Jungian psychology as nigredo, the alchemical stage of blackening, where the ego structure is dismantled, yet the true self has not yet taken its rightful throne. In the context of the modern world, such a state is often mistakenly perceived as mere demotivation. However, in Carl Gustav Jung's language, it is nothing less than a sacred pause, an intermediate space where the human soul, having withdrawn from external hustle, plunges inward to rewrite its profound myth. Nevertheless, our culture harbors a deep fear of this inner silence. Jung warned that modern society makes every effort to avoid confronting this critical phase. It seeks to pathologize it, overwhelm the individual with external noise, suppress or medicate it, because it is unable to comprehend a transformation that externally does not resemble conventional progress. However, what an individual experiences during this period is by no means a regression. On the contrary, it is a profound initiation. This state cannot be qualified as a dysfunction. Rather, it is a sacred descent into inner depths. This phenomenon should not be confused with clinical depression, although it may share some shadows and manifestations with it. Essentially, it is a manifestation of the soul refusing to participate in a life script with which it no longer deeply resonates. And it is precisely this state, according to Jung's views, that served as the starting point for the process of individuation, the sacred becoming of the authentic self. The vast majority of people rarely touch upon this sacred side of being, do they? This is a period when the pain following enlightenment and the deep silence that ensues after revelation becomes central. However, this silence is by no means an emptiness. It possesses powerful, formative potential. If an individual is capable of remaining in this stillness, heeding the inner voice and its demands, then it becomes possible to realize that what appears to be demotivation actually signifies the beginning of a profound psychic realignment. The external world often interprets this state as a loss of direction or wandering. However, the distinguished psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, on the contrary, would assert that it is nothing less than an honest and authentic transformation of the personality. It is precisely this aspect that will be the subject of further deep study. If anyone finds themselves wandering in the dense fog that inevitably follows a period of deep awakening, gazing into that motionless void where their inner spark once brightly blazed, they should know they are by no means broken. In fact, they are undergoing a profound psychic shift for which modern culture, unfortunately, lacks an adequate name. This is a metamorphosis of such deep scale that it is not limited merely to challenging habitual thoughts. It radically reconstructs the very fundamental architecture of a person's inner world. Former ambitions that once ignited an unquenchable flame in their chest, strict deadlines, ambitious goals, carefully designed 5-year plans, and all those inspiring motivational mantras of success, all now seem devoid of meaning and empty. This is not because the person has failed in any way or lost their abilities, but because the very inner structure that once served as a vessel for their old motivation is now in the process of disintegration. Carl Jung, the great thinker, foresaw this internal unraveling long before its essence became a subject of widespread discussion. It should be clearly understood that for a significant part of human life, an individual's driving force and energy originated from their persona, a specially constructed self, a kind of mask that one wore to interact with the world. This formed identity, seeking admiration, approval, and external applause, was not a flaw at all. On the contrary, it represented an integral and vital stage in the process of human development. As Jung himself accurately noted, the persona is a system of behavior which is imposed on the individual by the expectations of society. However, when a person undergoes the process of awakening, they begin to perceive this mask for what it truly is, nothing more than a performance. And this theatrical performance ceases to hold its former power over them. It becomes impossible to continue chasing external praise when one realizes that the very stage on which this drama unfolded is woven from ephemeral illusions. As a consequence of this transformation, goals that were once highly valued now feel utterly alien. They were formed by a self that no longer resides within the person. And this gives rise to a deep, almost mystical silence in their inner world, akin to the state of an actor who has left the stage and suddenly realized they have forgotten their lines. However, this happens not because of confusion or memory loss, but because the old script no longer resonates deep within their soul. A person feels devoid of a specific purpose, not because they have lost their bearings or direction, but because they have shed the identity that invariably demanded a certain destination. They have not been deprived of their inner impulse or drive. Rather, they have simply outgrown the old fuel that once powered their ambitions and moved them forward. What is now emerging and stirring within the person is neither emptiness nor deficiency, but a sacred, meaningful pause. It is a silent void that is preparing to be filled with something far more authentic and true, something no longer forged from external performance or play, but stemming from a deep, conscious presence in the present moment. If the ego previously pushed incessantly for action and achievement, the soul now patiently waits. And it is in this state of waiting, in this inner silence, that something truly sacred and profound begins to emerge. Carl Jung, the distinguished thinker and psychologist, asserted that the true purpose of human existence lies not in inflating the ego, but, on the contrary, in its harmonious integration into a broader and deeper psychic totality. According to him, a person comes into this world not to indulge the fleeting desires of their ego, but to subject it to thorough purification, tempering, and, ultimately, alignment with the self. The self, according to Jung, represents the transcendent center of our being, inextricably linking us to the great whole of the universe. He called this complex and multifaceted process individuation. Thus, the human life path is seen as a continuous movement from a state of inner fragmentation to the achievement of comprehensive wholeness. The meaning is not to become a self that is universally praised and approved, but to find the authentic, real self. The self, fundamentally different from the ego, does not seek external approval or a demonstration of productivity. Its driving force is not an ambitious striving for achievement, but rather a pursuit of inner alignment and harmony. The only thing it sincerely seeks is to express what is authentic truth. This is precisely why, after experiencing a profound spiritual awakening, the human psyche inevitably begins to undergo a process that can be called sacred recalibration. What once seemed incredibly engaging or significant now suddenly feels utterly empty and meaningless. One's entire internal system actively begins to reject everything artificial, imposed, or inauthentic. This can manifest as abandoning career paths that were built on inner insecurity, or relationships based solely on playing certain roles, or even a vision board created from the old self's deep fear of not being good enough. Such internal purging is often perceived as a paradoxical combination of deep liberation and complete disorientation. One sheds all that is false, but then the fundamental question inevitably arises: what will now fill the liberated space? The distinguished thinker Carl Gustav Jung repeatedly warned that a significant number of individuals become prisoners of a certain state. Some, having experienced spiritual awakening, inadvertently slide into what can be called spiritual bypassing, mistakenly interpreting transcendence as a way to escape reality. Such individuals seem to hover above earthly existence, declaring everything around them illusory and convincing themselves of the absolute meaninglessness of everything. However, it is important to realize that true detachment from worldly concerns is by no means equivalent to complete disengagement from them. The self, the deep essence of a person, by no means seeks for the individual to dissolve or disappear from the world. On the contrary, its desire is to manifest and fully reside in this world through human existence. It yearns not for evacuation from reality, but for its profound embodiment. Thus its quest is not for distancing, but for full embodiment. However, before achieving this deep embodiment, there lies a threshold that Carl Jung described very accurately, although few are able to recognize it while directly in that state. It is a kind of grey space that emerges after the moment of awakening, an emptiness that fills a person not with a sense of bliss, but rather with a feeling of deep bewilderment. This state possesses no poetic quality. It does not lend itself to fashionable aestheticization. Instead, it manifests as a quiet, silent dwelling, while the surrounding world moves rapidly forward, and the person is unable to explain or even understand into whom they are transforming. Jung would likely note that such a state is by no means a sign of failure. Rather, it is an in-between position. The individual has already managed to transcend their ego, but the self has not yet established itself as their true foundation. This liminal space, this transitional stage, should not be perceived as an error or failure. In fact, it is a deep initiation, a kind of descent into the uncharted depths of one's own being, for which modern culture shows surprising impatience. The stillness characteristic of this state is often mistakenly diagnosed as mere laziness, and a necessary pause in development is confused with complete paralysis. As a result, the individual begins to judge themselves, and it is this judgment that transforms into an insurmountable wall, blocking the path of the life energy that their soul calls to return home. This unique phase is truly sacred. It should be viewed as a pupal stage, preceding transformation, and by no means as a collapse or destruction. And if an individual shows enough resilience to remain in this state for an extended period, if they can successfully resist the temptation to rush or retreat from it, then gradually they will begin to feel it. A quiet but persistent pulse of something significantly deeper and more fundamental will rise within them. The self, this inner essence, does not announce itself loudly, but its presence is constant and unwavering, and it patiently awaits the moment when the person can trust what cannot yet be expressed in words or named. Carl Gustav Jung, the distinguished thinker, designated this sacred reversal of inner energy with a specific term, enantiodromia. He used this word to describe the phenomenon where something, pushed to its extreme, inevitably transforms into its opposite. And nowhere is this profound phenomenon manifested as clearly and dramatically as in the period following so-called awakening. A person who experiences it transitions from the frantic, almost manic, egoic urge expressed in the drive of "I must get everything done, do everything," to a state of deep and seemingly emptying stillness of the soul, questioning, why do anything at all? This pendulum swing occurs not because the individual is broken or has failed, but because nature itself demands equilibrium. The psyche, which for a long time was confined by rigid frameworks of productivity and constant achievement, finally collapses into a state of rest and inertia. And this deep descent should not be viewed as a pathological deviation. On the contrary, it is a true initiation. In the language of myths and archetypes, this state embodies the archetype of the hermit, a period of voluntary withdrawal from the world preceding a new rebirth. This state can be compared to a sacred cocoon within which a caterpillar undergoes complete transformation, dissolving into a formless substance. At this moment, it is no longer the crawling self, but it has not yet become the soaring creature. This is a phase that can metaphorically be called the goo phase, unstructured, undefined, and utterly unproductive by all modern standards and criteria. However, it is absolutely necessary because it is during this period that the psyche undergoes a complex alchemical transformation. And such a transformation, as Jung repeatedly emphasized, always begins in darkness, not in avoiding difficult experiences, not only in the pursuit of good vibes, but precisely in a deep descent into oneself. It is here that modern spirituality often loses its true depth, as it tends to glamorize and romanticize awakening itself, while completely avoiding its painful but necessary part, which can be compared to a crucifixion. The great thinker Carl Jung tirelessly emphasized that the shadow, those rejected, sometimes very inconvenient, and hidden aspects of the human personality in the depths of the unconscious, is not something to be avoided or sought to be gotten rid of. On the contrary, he asserted the necessity of their full integration. Working with this shadow, contrary to popular misconception, is by no means an esoteric or advanced stage of spiritual development. It constitutes in essence the fundamental basis for achieving true wholeness of being. And in that state of peculiar non-being or inner pause, in which a person sometimes finds themselves, the unconscious begins to manifest not as a frightening antagonist, but rather as an important messenger. Everything that was once diligently suppressed, be it deep grief, raging anger, or unmet needs, gradually begins to surface into consciousness. This happens because in the present moment, the necessary inner space for their manifestation has finally opened up. In response, the ego, accustomed to control and order, is seized by panic. It desperately seeks concrete actions, clear answers, wants a name tag for what is happening so that everything is understandable and classified. However, the true self, acting much more subtly, begins to quietly but steadily whisper, "Surrender. I am creating something far deeper and more significant." It is at this moment that true deep inner work begins. It manifests not in striving for external achievement, but in a willingness to fully surrender to the inner process. It is not about seeking instant clarity or definitive answers, but about humble yet attentive observation of what is unfolding. It's important to understand. The human psyche during this period is not failing, as it might appear superficially. On the contrary, it is actively engaged in a colossal reorganization, removing years of accumulated noise, dismantling illusions, and re-evaluating false aspirations that once defined life. This internal process seems to pause one's usual drive, insatiable ambitions, and even the basic hunger for external stimuli or achievements. Thus, one is left with no choice but to be alone with what they have so long and carefully hidden deep within what was buried beneath layers of daily life. And it is in this absolute stillness, in this astonishing, almost mystical emptiness, that one gradually begins to recover lost fragments of memories and retrieve forgotten truths. And then, almost imperceptibly to consciousness, something entirely new begins to stir and quietly take root within, portending future changes. A completely different form of impetus to action begins to manifest in one's life, but it is radically different from the usual impulses of the past. Its origins are not rooted in anxiety or fear. It has no compulsive urgency and does not seek external manifestations. Its voice is not loud, but rather resembles a quiet, soothing purr. This is an inner impulse, driven by the deeper layers of the soul, calling for movement not from a sense of duty, but from a profound understanding that inaction would be a betrayal of one's inner truth. Carl Jung defined this phenomenon as the awakening of the self, not as an abstract concept, but as a genuine, vibrant inner compass pulsating within a person. It doesn't pursue, but rather gently invites. And what it guides the individual towards is not ephemeral success, but a deep state of wholeness and completeness. Thus, having crossed an inner threshold, one enters a state of deep silence. They experience stillness not as stagnation or idleness, but as a sacred, meaningful pause. The individual has journeyed through the labyrinths of an inner night, where no call was heard and no guiding light flickered. It is at this very moment that something archaic and ancient begins to awaken and manifest. This manifests not as a resounding call or a blinding flash, but as a subtle inner summons, a gentle, pulsating rhythm that doesn't urge a return to the past, but rather invites the creation of what has not yet existed. This is the first, barely perceptible whisper of the self, manifesting not through words but through a profound feeling, an undeniable pull, and a palpable presence. Carl Jung named this the symbolic life. It is an existence no longer dictated by the ego or societal conventions, but guided and shaped by deeper, archetypal forces of the soul. Once the dominance of the ego is relinquished, and the process of honoring the unconscious begins, being ceases to be merely a struggle for survival and transforms into the unfolding of profound, multifaceted meaning. And here, a surprising paradox emerges. Outwardly, this process can appear remarkably ordinary and undramatic. When the self assumes the leading role, the individual stops frantically striving and instead begins to act, responding to inner impulses. They are driven not by a panicked fear of missing an opportunity, but by a calm and confident conviction in their attained inner balance and alignment. One stops desperately chasing clarity as a desired prize, and instead learns to recognize it when it naturally appears. Often this clarity manifests as astonishing simplicity. A life based on the authentic self by no means implies a constant surge of energy or unwavering confidence. Exhaustion, inner wavering, and sorrow still permeate human existence, being an integral part of its multifaceted fabric. However, with this way of life, the agonizing and relentless suffering from self-betrayal disappears, that oppressive exhaustion arising from the need to conform to a version of oneself that has long ceased to be relevant or true. Instead, a deep and significant transformation occurs. In this process, one finds themselves capable of creativity even when external approval is absent. They learn to say a firm no, despite universal expectation of agreement. They begin to follow inner impulses and wonder, rather than merely mechanically performing prescribed tasks. They consciously choose inner peace over a constant race for productivity. This state is not a manifestation of inertia or passivity. On the contrary, it becomes a new source of energy, new fuel for existence. It's not an adrenaline rush, but a harmonious alignment with one's own essence, not external pressure, but a deep presence in the moment. Carl Gustav Jung once characterized this as the symbolic life, not an escape into illusory fantasies, but a return to the depths of one's own soul. The individual begins to trust the unspoken language of dreams, intuitive insights, symbolic signs, and synchronous events. Their existence transforms from a meaningless monologue shouted into the void into an authentic dialogue with the invisible aspects of reality. But how does this life manifest in practice? Sometimes it's expressed in a subtle yet fundamental shift in the questions one asks oneself. Instead of the insistent, "What should I do?" a deeper, "What quietly calls me from within?" resonates. Instead of the pragmatic, "What's my plan of action?" an open question arises. Where is the flow of life directing me? And instead of striving to prove one's worth through "How can I prove myself?" one turns to their inner compass with the question, "What feels true to me?" The individual moves away from seeking to control life's circumstances, transitioning to active and harmonious participation in them. Ambitions and aspirations do not fade. On the contrary, they undergo a profound metamorphosis. They transform into a deep devotion, a loyalty to what is authentic, true, and life-giving for the very essence of being. Remarkably, such devotion gains the power to overcome any obstacles, literally moving mountains. It facilitates the achievement of goals, but no longer by depleting internal resources, but through a state of inner wholeness and harmony. This approach becomes not only sustainable, but also nourished from the depths of the soul. This is the true motivation of the self, prompting not external impression, but sincere inner expression. It guides one, often effortlessly, on a path of creativity, continuous learning, inner healing, and selfless service. This happens not due to external compulsion or duty, but because the individual's entire being resonates with this path, uttering an unconditional yes. Thus, if anyone has wondered where their inner spark went after experiencing an awakening, remember, it has not extinguished. The old flame simply exhausted itself to make way for a deeper, more enduring fire. This new flame is not destined to flicker or fade, even in the strongest storms that shake the world. As is known, Carl Jung, a distinguished thinker, never promised ease of being, yet he consistently pointed to the possibility of attaining true depth. The fact that the reader is engaging with these lines testifies to their movement along this path. This is not the culmination of the awakening process, but merely the prelude to genuine individuation. If a loved one silently resists false notions that love is necessarily intertwined with suffering, that self-sacrifice is an inevitable price for deep connection, or that they themselves are unworthy of inner peace, then they should firmly grasp this. Authentic love never demands that one diminish or suppress their essence. A true, sincere connection does not imply sacrificing one's soul. And undoubtedly the most significant union one can forge in life is an unbreakable bond with their own inner truth. Gratitude is extended for not merely engaging with this text, but for embarking on one's inner work, that sacred labor connected with the deep remembrance of one's true essence. And may it always be remembered, when the truly destined person appears on the horizon, their soul will unmistakably recognize them not through the lens of fear, but through an all-encompassing peace. However, until that moment arrives, one's most cherished relationships must be those carefully cultivated within themselves. This forms the unshakable foundation. This is the true home, a secure sanctuary. And only from this inner wholeness, from this harmonious state, does everything authentic and sincere emerge.